When Julia told me she was dating, I felt my heart race. It wasn't the idea of seeing her enchanted that disturbed me. It was the fact that she was still so young, having just turned 18. Miguel, she said with a radiant look, as if that name held the mystery of her recent joy. And who is Miguel? I asked, feigning naturalness as I organized the kitchen counter. He goes to my school, but he's in his last year. He's wonderful, Mom. He knows so many things. Julia smiled as if that was enough to explain everything about him. Something inside me was uneasy. An older boy, what purpose would he have? Julia's face was radiant with a joy that I didn't want to destroy, but the uneasiness inside me grew like a shadow. When she announced, a few days later, that she wanted to bring him to dinner, I was apprehensive. Are you sure? You don't even know him well, I argued, trying to put it off. Mom, you always say it's essential to get to know people. Why not give him a chance? Julia replied with that adolescent firmness that I recognized was impossible to overcome. On the night of the dinner, the tension was almost visible. My husband Roberto was next to me at the table, absorbed as always with work messages on his cell phone. I felt isolated in my apprehension, while Julia prepared the table with an excitement I hadn't seen since when she still believed in magical stories. When Miguel arrived, I admit that my initial impression was not negative. He was kind, with a smile that seemed genuine. He brought us a wine, a gesture that surprised and made me apprehensive. How old are you? I asked, examining him like a rigorous investigator. 19, ma'am. He answered with a calmness that seemed studied. Dinner passed between my suspicious questions and his diplomatic answers. Roberto, on the other hand, remained practically absent from the conversation, alternating between laughter and my questions and talk about work. He's special, Mom, isn't he? Julia asked after Miguel left, her voice full of expectation. He seems polite, I murmured as I collected the dishes, but internally I was still unsure. Something about him, perhaps his exaggerated serenity, perhaps the speed with which he won over Julia, made me feel that I needed to be vigilant. That night, lying next to Roberto, who was already sleeping silently, I couldn't fall asleep. My mind was buzzing with doubts and fears. Was I being unfair? Did he really deserve my trust, or was he just trying to protect Julia from something inevitable? The answers didn't come, but one certainty remained. Miguel was not someone I would allow into our lives without first fully understanding who he was. Miguel began to visit our house more often, always with the same perfect politeness that left me uncomfortably surrendered. Julia seemed to brighten up with each visit, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't help but notice how she smiled more, hummed as she helped in the kitchen, and sometimes gave me unexpected hugs, something she'd rarely done since I was a teenager. He'd come by on Saturday afternoons, bringing little gifts that he made sure to include me. A flower arrangement for the dinner table or a bag of freshly baked bread from the local bakery. One of those afternoons, while Julia was in her room getting ready, I ended up alone with Miguel in the living room. He was sitting on the couch, leafing through a book I had left there, when I decided to break the silence. Do you have any siblings, Miguel? I asked, more to fill the moment than out of real interest. I have a younger sister, he replied, closing the book delicately. She's 15 and thinks she understands everything about life. She reminds me of Julia when she's convinced of her ideas. I couldn't help but smile a little. It was the first time he had shared something personal without that formality he seemed to use as protection. And your parents? I continued, maintaining a relaxed tone but analyzing his words carefully. My mother is a teacher. My father works in mechanics. They always encouraged me to study and to do my best. I think I inherited that persistence from them, he said naturally, but there was an authenticity in his description of his family that awakened something different in me, perhaps a first glimpse of credibility. It's important to have a strong family structure, I commented without realizing it. When Julia came down the stairs, happy and smiling about something in particular, Miguel stood up instantly with that look in his eyes that was impossible not to notice. It was as if everything around him disappeared, as if she were his entire world, and for the first time that didn't seem like something to worry me. That same day, Roberto finally interacted with Miguel during dinner. It was something brief, but Roberto, always objective and direct, asked about Miguel's future plans. I plan to study mechanical engineering, Miguel replied with an enthusiasm that made Roberto look up from his plate for the first time that night. Excellent choice, he said, nodding. That was enough for Miguel to win my husband's approval, something that made me feel both calm and upset. How could he decide so easily that Miguel was trustworthy? In the days that followed, I realized that something in me was changing. I still had my reservations, but it was impossible to ignore the way Miguel treated Julia with consideration, the way he always offered to help around the house without being asked, and the way he showed genuine interest in getting to know our family. My initial resistance began to fade, albeit slowly and reluctantly. Perhaps, I reflected one night as I was organizing Julia's clothes, I was simply holding on to an irrational fear that my daughter was growing up and no longer being exclusively mine. Maybe Miguel wasn't the problem. I was. But even with these considerations, I couldn't completely let my guard down, because that nagging uncertainty still lingered. Was he really as upright as he seemed? Miguel's visits to our house became a regular occurrence. I no longer felt that initial apprehension when he arrived, but I kept a close eye on him, looking for any clue that would justify my initial hesitation. Despite this, the moments of togetherness began to intensify. On a cloudy Sunday afternoon, Julia suggested that Miguel help us organize the attic, a task that Roberto had been putting off for years. We went upstairs together, facing dusty boxes and stored memories, while Julia, excited, opened one trunk after another. "Look at this!" Julia exclaimed, showing an old photo of our family. "I was about 4 years old here, Mom. Look how cute I was." Miguel took the photo delicately, observing it carefully. "You really were very cute," he said smiling. "But honestly, I still think you are." The comment made Julia blush and drew a spontaneous smile from me. The way he looked at her, with admiration and genuine affection, began to feel less like an act and more like something real. As they talked and joked, I realized that there was a space in their relationship where my interference was not necessary. It was strange to admit it to myself, but something in that moment, amidst the laughter and dust, began to alter my perception of Miguel. Later that day, as I was preparing dinner, Miguel came into the kitchen to help, something he did occasionally. It was one of those small actions he performed naturally, without effort or pretense. "Do you want me to cut the carrots?" he asked, grabbing a knife and an apron before he could even hear my answer. "You seem very comfortable here," I commented, testing the waters. "I like being here," he replied, looking at me as he cut the carrots with precision. "Your house has a good energy. It feels like a real home." There was something in his voice, a touch of melancholy perhaps, that made me stop what I was doing. "And your house doesn't feel like a home?" I asked. He shrugged, a small but meaningful gesture. "My family is wonderful, but my parents always worked a lot. Sometimes the house felt empty." His sincerity disarmed me again. He wasn't trying to impress me, he was just sharing a piece of himself, and that was something I couldn't ignore. That night, while Julia and Miguel watched a movie in the living room, I stayed nearby, organizing books on the shelf and observing them out of the corner of my eye. Roberto walked past them quickly, mumbling something about soccer on the TV in the bedroom, but I stayed. The way Miguel treated Julia, how he listened to her attentively, how he laughed at her simplest jokes, All of this began to convince me that maybe he was, after all, the right person for her. It was a thought that was both reassuring and disturbing. For years, I had prepared myself for the moment when Julia would bring someone home, someone who would share the space that had previously been ours alone. I never imagined that I could eventually like this person, but at the same time, there was something that bothered me, something that I couldn't name, but that was there, hovering over our most peaceful moments like a silent shadow. Little by little, Miguel was becoming more than just my daughter's boyfriend. He was becoming part of our family. When I got home that Friday, exhausted after a long day at work, the sound of Julia and Miguel's laughter echoed through the house, coming from upstairs. They were in the playroom, a rarely used space at the end of the hallway. I dropped my bag on the couch and went into the kitchen, where I found Roberto, as usual, distracted by his newspaper and a cup of coffee. He looked up briefly, nodded, and then went back to focusing on the pages. "They're having fun, I guess," I said, reaching for a glass of water. "Oh, they are," he replied without looking up. "I think it's good that she's happy. He seems like a good guy." His indifference sometimes irritated me, but at that moment, I wished I had the same lightness to face all of this. As I walked up the stairs, I heard the muffled sound of voices, laughter, and something that sounded like a board game being shuffled. "Let me explain," Julia said with a laugh. "You always complicate everything," Miguel replied, clearly amused. I smiled to myself. It was impossible not to admit that the dynamic between them was charming. Miguel seemed to bring out a lighter side of Julia, something I hadn't seen often since she had entered university. When I reached the hallway, I hesitated for a moment. The door to the game room was ajar, and the sound of their voices became clearer. "You know I would do anything for you, don't you?" Miguel's voice suddenly became serious, breaking the playful tone that filled the room. "I know," Julia replied softly, almost in a whisper. The sentence echoed in my mind in a way I hadn't expected. There was something in his tone that carried more than casual words, something that made my heart race. I approached slowly, treading carefully so as not to make any noise, until I was close enough to see through the crack in the door. Julia was sitting on the floor, leaning against a pile of pillows, her messy hair falling over her shoulders. Miguel was on his knees in front of her, so close that their faces were almost touching. His hand held her face gently, as if she was something precious and fragile. For a moment, I felt as if the air had been knocked out of my lungs. I knew they were together, I knew there was a relationship there, but I had never seen it, that raw, unprotected intimacy, where two people seem to exist only for each other. It wasn't just affection or attraction, it was something deeper, something that almost scared me because it was so real. They didn't notice me. I stood there, frozen, unable to move or break the moment. And then, suddenly, Miguel leaned in, and I knew what was coming next. I ran back to the bedroom to tell my husband. "I don't know how far this would have gone if I hadn't caught her," I said breathlessly. "Thank God Julia was safe. She can't commit to a new life now." Roberto looked at me, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Julia told me she's never done it, and she's sure Miguel has too. I wonder how good her first time will be." "My first time wasn't anything special," he said, smiling. My husband said, "So you found me and discovered how good love could be." Feeling that familiar rush, I smiled. "Oh yes, indeed. How about you remind me how good it can be?" As we were comfortable in bed, it was easy for my husband to wrap his arms around me and start to awaken my need, my desire, turning it into a flame. I couldn't deny that finding my daughter in this situation caused a sudden fever, an insane desire to open myself to someone. My husband loves the beginning of things, and his touches and kisses all over my body were turning me on even more. His mouth sought the most familiar recess in his life. He tasted, savored, and kissed me even more, taking me higher and higher until I felt the spasms starting deep inside, and I pulled his mouth firmly against me, feeling his careful attention to the production of my juices as I shuddered and moaned with such intensity. He stood up, those pleasant inches compact as stone and ready for action, and I met him with a smile full of lust, arms and more open. I could feel the pressure of his piston challenging me. Then he uncovered me and I gasped with love as he parted those walls, until the pendulum finally welcomed me in full. I gasped, "Yes, oh yes, I love you. Give it to me. I want to feel you let go. I want to feel you slipping out and filling me so hot." My husband was happy to hear me urging him on. He settled into a steady rhythm, ramming my burning core over and over, and I could feel my elation quickly beginning to build again. I was grunting with intensity as he feasted. I heard him. "Oh my God, I'm giving in, yes, 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 yes." I could feel my inner tension tightening those walls against his part, uncontrolled, urging him to finish it all. Looking up at my face in the throes of satisfaction, he cried out, and I felt the strong thrust, his eruption, the love finally escaping, filling me. My flower wrapped tightly around him, milking every drop of his swelling. We lay on the bed, breathless, sweaty, and very satisfied. My mind went back to Julia, and I said, "It's a shame they don't have an instructor to show them how to do it, and do it right." My husband replied, "Well, what if we instruct them? We show them how to make the passion happen. And then, if they feel comfortable with the idea, we watch them." "How would we do that?" I asked, a little nervously. "That would be the best way. They need to see exactly what it's like, and no cartoon or lecture can convey that message better than that." I was still a little nervous, but he reminded me that at 40 I still had an incredible body, more than some women half my age would ever want to have. Firm, full breasts, a curvy waist, and slightly flared hips. At 5 feet 11 inches and 180 pounds, when he picks me up in his arms, I can always feel the inner turmoil quickly heating up. I feel so lucky to have a husband who cares about my appearance. I took a deep breath and said, "Let's do this. Let's show our honey and her boyfriend how to do it." I knew they had a date on Friday night. "I'll tell Julia we want to have a talk with them before the date on Friday." That night, I could see the "we're in trouble" look on Julia's face. I suppressed the urge to smile. On Friday night, we had 2 nervous young adults sitting on the couch, while Roberto and I stood in front of them. "Now, we know it's normal for young people to have the feelings and desires that you two have. We did too when we were that age," I began. "Mom, we don't need another one of those lectures," Julia said. "Oh, this isn't a lecture. We'll show you how it all works," I replied. The expressions that formed as the understanding began were priceless. Julia seemed to resist, but Miguel quickly warmed up to the idea. Julia stammered, You want us to..." "Well, you said yourself that another lecture won't do anything. So we want to show you exactly how to do it," I explained. Miguel perked up even more. The fact that he was going to actually see me had decided the issue for him. Then he said, "Julia, I think that's a good idea. It'll certainly be something memorable for a first time." Julia was still a little hesitant, but she agreed, and we led them into the bedroom. 2 chairs were placed next to the bed, and we gestured for them to sit. Across the bed, Roberto and I turned to each other, and our lips met. Our hands unbuttoned, unzipped, and removed clothing until Roberto was naked and I was dressed only in my skimpy red lingerie. It was exhilarating when Roberto knelt down, and I looked down and watched as he began to remove my underwear. He pulled it away from my moist lips, and when it fell to my ankles, I glanced at our audience. Miguel was eagerly watching, taking in as much as his eyes could see. As I pulled down what was left of my husband and his presence became evident, I could see Julia's eyes widen as she watched. I said, "Now, for your first time, we expect you to do what we do. And if you want to be a great lover, do this every time." Roberto and I joined forces. He laid me down and gave me a long session of foreplay. My sighs and sounds of intensity let our audience know how good it felt. Leading the way, I let him know where I wanted his mouth to go, and his mouth was quickly pressed against my center, his breath hot and tongue working. I peeked out at our audience and noticed that Miguel looked uncomfortable in his pants. He unzipped his pants to give him some relief, and Julia had one hand over his, feeling him out, while his hand sought refuge under her skirt, skillful fingers doing the work. This went on as Roberto met my needs over and over again. I felt my juices leaking out, the spasms starting deep inside, and I let out a sound of intensity as I reached my climax, rocking my body, making me tremble and shudder with ecstasy as the wave engulfed me. Roberto lay down, and I rocked into the inviting position. With a smile of desire and a sound of affection, I mounted him, joining myself to him again. I loved the feeling of the walls stretching as my weight pinned his to the furniture. I looked at the audience and said, "We think you should try this position, so Julia can control how far you can go with her. Since she's new to it, she might not be able to handle much." Excitedly, I stayed where I was, rubbing and comforting her to keep her stimulated. "Now, after this introduction and the pain of the crossing is gone, you can try other positions like this." I turned to Roberto and asked, "Turn me over, darling." Pressing my body tightly to his, we rolled over, and as I stood up, I wrapped my arms around his waist as he pushed me back down onto the mattress without restraint. He wanted to sink into the sea again. Panting and unable to hold back my mischievous voice, I suggested another position. I whispered for him to get into the feline pose and placed my peach right up there. I looked at Julia and Miguel, their faces lit up with interest, breathing heavily, watching our every move. I made way for what was coming. Roberto armed himself for battle, standing behind me. I howled announcing his arrival as my heat forced his understanding. He made sure I stayed firmly on his base, giving me freedom to move calmly. I felt his hands grip my hips, angrily digging that much-visited opening, hammering repeatedly. I stared at the young men, and it was making me feel nauseous with madness. Their looks of newcomers to life, and I, a mature and experienced woman with many experiences. I was happy to hand this world over to my little girl, and I knew she would love every sip of that cup. I was exuberant for her to see her father plant the seed of life, waiting, stripped and austere. Her mother was dilated and exposed to the world, wanting to live and be lived. My motherly speech immediately wanted to feed on his feelings, but I waited for the man who was fighting with me to finish his gratitude, leaving the burden deposited where it should be. I felt a strong swelling caused by the exaggerated flow of blood and the pumping. I looked at the young men, and before I could even bring up the idea of observing them, Julia said shyly, "Miguel and I are wondering if we could have our first time now, and if you could stay with us and guide us." I smiled at Roberto and said, "Honey, we'd be happy to help you." Roberto and I sat and watched Julia being discovered by Miguel. I could see the effect that his body had on the testosterone present. What seemed to have completely drained away filled up again. Julia got Miguel ready, picking up the sword, and my sanctuary also seemed to prepare. Those who were in bed went to the chairs to watch the spectacle. The young men tried to repeat the same battle positions that we had tried. We were loving it all, and to make it easier for the new host to pass through, I carefully picked up my beautiful girl and opened her passage. The boy lost his grip on the stake and got stuck halfway through. It was then that I courageously held his spear, helped him slide through, and the boy looked me in the eyes, almost as if he was telling me he loved me. Since the passage was still very narrow, I decided to use a little of the fluid I had to make it easier. I told my daughter I would use some juice, and she said it was no problem. I put that new thing in my mouth, spent a few seconds on it, and then returned it to my beloved's crib, and it finally passed, completing its cycle. Roberto was proud and came up to me, hugging me from behind, and before we knew it, the four of us were dancing, teaching each other, swapping partners, helping each other. I was helping her boyfriend helping me, Roberto helping her, and she helping her father. Occasionally, we suggested changes in the way we acted when we saw that my daughter was adapting to the movements. And so, I instructed the young man how to summon what we wanted to see, and that when it came out, he should throw it directly at my daughter. I helped him with this, holding his sword firmly and helping him bring the white power. It was so difficult for him that he almost lost all his strength, and when it came, he ended up leaving some of it in me too, as a good warrior would do. I was enchanted and decided to clean up the mess myself. Now it's your father's turn. She prepared to receive him with intensity, opened herself and was covered by more of that preciousness. In the end, the boys left us alone, talking, and the two of us ended up dancing together with all the teachings we had learned. She thanked me for being such a good mother and teacher.